Most people spend their whole lives trying to find peace. Vanessa Miller had spent hers running from it, and on one biting cold morning, hidden deep in the wilds of Montana, she discovered that no matter how far you run, some things will find you anyway. The world had moved on without her, and that was exactly how Vanessa wanted it. She lived alone, tucked away 50 miles from the nearest town, in a sagging, weather-beaten cabin she'd inherited from her grandfather. Out here, surrounded by endless forests and the towering snow-drenched peaks, the silence was more than just an absence of noise. It was a shield, thick, heavy, and complete. A place where no memories could reach her unless she allowed them to. For months now, she had allowed no one in. No family calls, no emails from old friends, no concerned knocks on her door. It was easier that way. Easier to live with the hole inside her chest where her heart used to be. Vanessa had once been strong, a combat medic in the army for over a decade. She'd seen things that would break most people. But nothing had broken her quite like the day she got the call that her son Jake wasn't coming home. One moment, she was standing in her kitchen folding laundry, humming to an old country song crackling from the radio. The next, her world had collapsed. 2 soldiers in dress uniforms on her front step, their solemn faces telling her everything before they even spoke a word. She hadn't heard a single sentence they said after that. She only remembered the blur, the funeral, the endless condolences that meant nothing, the hollow look in her husband's eyes. Grief tore them apart, piece by piece, until all that remained were bitter arguments and silence so heavy it choked her. Eventually, Vanessa packed a single duffel bag and drove until the roads turned from paved to gravel, until the only thing left between her and oblivion were the trees, the snow, and the ghosts she carried with her. Each morning now was a ritual of survival. Wake up, breathe, check the perimeter, chop wood, make coffee, move through the motions so the emptiness didn't swallow her whole. That morning had begun the same way. A frigid wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the loose shutters and carrying the sharp scent of pine and frozen earth through the cracks in the old wood. Vanessa had wrapped herself in her thickest coat and stepped onto the porch, a chipped enamel mug warming her hands. She blew into it absent-mindedly, staring across the clearing where the snow lay undisturbed, a perfect white blanket over a broken world. But something was different. At first, it was just a feeling, a prickling at the back of her neck, the same instinct that had once saved her life during a night patrol in Kandahar. She set her coffee down slowly, her eyes narrowing as they swept across the tree line. The forest should have been still, silent, except for the groan of the wind through the evergreens. Yet, in the middle of the clearing, she spotted something strange. Tracks. Wide, uneven trails cutting through the fresh powder, leading from the forest edge toward the cabin. It wasn't a deer, too wide, not a bear, no paw prints. Vanessa's pulse quickened, every muscle in her body tensing with the kind of readiness that never fully left a soldier. Without thinking, she slipped into her boots and followed the trail, each crunch of her footfalls swallowed by the heavy snow. Her mind raced through possibilities. Poachers, a lost hunter, something worse. The tracks led her further from the cabin, past the line of pines, into a narrow path winding through the trees. She crouched low, examining the marks more closely. Something had been dragged here, something heavy. The snow was churned up in places, dark stains of frozen earth showing through. Her breath misted in the air as she moved, every sense straining for any sound, any movement. Then, through the white haze, she saw it. A horse. No, a Mustang, wild, battered and exhausted, its smoke-grey coat a patchwork of ice and mud. The animal stood trembling, sides heaving as it dragged a filthy canvas bag behind it, clutched awkwardly in its teeth. It took Vanessa a second to process what she was seeing. Wild Mustangs didn't approach humans. They didn't drag human belongings through the forest like lost dogs. Her gut told her something was terribly wrong. She froze, heart hammering in her chest, as the Mustang's dark eyes locked onto hers. Not with fear, but with a desperate, pleading intensity that rooted Vanessa to the spot. The bag it carried sagged heavily, thudding against the snow as the Mustang took one labored step forward, then another, each movement slower, more pained than the last. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the three of them, the broken woman, the battered horse, and the mysterious burden between them. Vanessa didn't move, didn't dare breathe. She watched as the Mustang stumbled forward, released the bag with a heavy grunt, and then, without waiting for a reaction, staggered backward a few steps before collapsing onto its haunches in the snow, watching her, waiting. In that instant, Vanessa knew with a bone-deep certainty that whatever was inside that bag was alive, and that it was counting on her to save it. She had spent months running from the world, from her past, from the pain. But now the world had come crashing into her lonely clearing, demanding more than her grief, demanding the part of her that had always fought to save others, no matter how broken she was inside. And as she took her first steps toward the canvas bag, she felt something stir in her for the first time in a year. Hope. Her boots sank deep into the snow with every step as she crossed the clearing, her heart pounding louder than the wind that hissed through the trees around her. The bag lay slumped against the churned earth, battered and caked with ice, its seams frayed and split open in places. For one terrible moment Vanessa hesitated, her mind bracing for the worst. She knew the weight of what could be waiting inside, the kind of brokenness the world sometimes left behind. She'd seen it too many times in dusty, sun-blasted battlefields halfway across the world. Bodies abandoned, hope extinguished. And yet, despite every instinct telling her to guard her heart, she knelt down beside the bag, reaching for the frozen zipper with fingers that trembled not from the cold, but from something far deeper. The zipper resisted at first, stiff with frost, before giving way with a harsh metallic rasp. The smell hit her immediately: blood, urine, sweat, the cloying sweetness of infection, a scent she knew all too well, a scent that slammed her back into every field hospital, every makeshift triage center she had ever worked in. Without meaning to, she held her breath, steeling herself as she peeled back the flap of canvas and looked inside. Curled within the bag, nearly motionless, was a tiny foal. Its coat, which should have been soft and pristine, was matted with blood, dirt, and tangled pieces of hay. One of its legs bent at an unnatural angle, the hoof twisted in a way that made Vanessa's stomach twist with anger and horror. Rope burns ringed its delicate neck, dark and raw against the pale skin beneath the fur. Its eyes, glassy, pain-filled and unfocused, blinked slowly at her, struggling to stay open. Vanessa's throat closed around a sob she refused to release. Training took over where emotion threatened to paralyze her. She slipped a hand beneath the foal's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, faint and thready, but it was there. Whoever had done this had intended to kill it, or had simply stopped caring whether it lived or died. And yet somehow, against all odds, this tiny creature had survived long enough to be brought here, delivered by a mother who should have been wild and untouchable, but who had instead placed all her trust in a broken human being standing alone in the snow. She looked up at the Mustang, the mare, the mother, who stood a few feet away, her entire body trembling with exhaustion, but her head held high, her dark eyes locked onto Vanessa's with a ferocity that brooked no misunderstanding. "Save it," the gaze seemed to say. "Save my baby." Vanessa whispered a soft curse under her breath, fighting back the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. This was no accident. This foal had been tied, dragged, injured. The evidence was written in every bloodied scrape, every bruise, every too shallow breath. And as much as Vanessa wanted to stay hidden in her fortress of grief, to keep the world at bay, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she was the only chance this foal had. Working quickly, she shrugged off her thick parka and wrapped it around the shivering body, careful to avoid jostling the injured leg. The foal weighed almost nothing, a terrifying weightlessness that spoke of dehydration, starvation, and days, if not longer, spent in agony. She gathered the bundle into her arms, feeling the frail heartbeat flutter against her chest like the wings of a dying bird. The mare snorted once, a low, trembling sound, and took a hesitant step closer. Vanessa met her gaze again, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding forged not by words, but by shared desperation. "I'll try," Vanessa whispered, her voice raw. "I swear I'll try." The mare bobbed her head once, an almost human gesture, before backing away slowly, disappearing into the fringe of trees like a ghost swallowed by the storm. Vanessa turned toward the cabin, every movement slow and deliberate, cradling the fragile life against her like a mother shielding her newborn from a cruel world. Each step back toward shelter felt like an act of defiance against the darkness that had tried to claim both her and the foal. The door to the cabin stuck from the frost as she shoved it open with her shoulder, kicking it closed behind her with a sharp thud. Inside, the air was barely warmer than the outdoors, but it was enough. She laid the foal down on the patched couch nearest the wood stove, grabbing an armful of old wool blankets from the shelf to build a nest around the trembling body. The stove crackled as she stoked it back to life, feeding it split logs until the small space filled with the smell of burning pine and the first real warmth in days. Only when the foal was bundled tightly, the worst of the shivers beginning to ease, did Vanessa allow herself a breath. She crouched beside the tiny creature, gently brushing matted fur from its forehead, whispering nonsense words of comfort she hadn't spoken aloud to anyone since Jake was alive. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, heavier than the snow piling up against the cabin walls outside. She had come to these mountains to disappear, to let the pain eat her from the inside without witness. But now, against her will, against her plan, life had found her, fragile, broken, bloody, but alive, and in the wide, pain-filled eyes of the foal, she saw a mirror of herself. Not dead, not yet. The foal barely moved, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths, each one a battle against a body that had been pushed past its limits. Vanessa knelt beside it, her hands working automatically, years of battlefield training surfacing like a current pulling her under. She needed to act fast, needed to stabilize it before the cold, the injuries or sheer exhaustion pulled it under for good. Her mind raced as she inventoried what little she had. A battered field medic kit stuffed with gauze, an old emergency blanket tucked in her closet, a few leftover antibiotics she'd hoarded more from habit than planning. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. She found a clean towel, dampened it with water from a pot warming on the stove, and began carefully wiping the worst of the blood and dirt from the foal's coat. Each touch was gentle, deliberate, every fiber of her being focused on not causing more pain. The filth revealed wounds she hadn't seen before, deep abrasions along the foal's sides, a raw ring around its throat where the rope had cut deep, an ugly, swollen gash on its flank that looked suspiciously like it had been made by something more deliberate than a simple fall. Rage simmered in Vanessa's veins, hot and blinding, but she pushed it down. Anger would not save this life, only action. When the worst of the grime was cleared away, she turned her attention to the broken leg. Even to her untrained eye, it was bad, a clean break, but if left untreated, it would kill the foal through infection or starvation. She rummaged through her kit until she found the supplies she needed, fashioning a rough but stable splint out of padded sticks and medical tape. Her hands didn't shake as she worked. They had steadied through gunfire, through screams, through the endless chaos of war, and they were steady now, even as her heart threatened to break anew for the tiny creature fighting for every breath on her couch. When the splint was in place and the foal was as stable as she could make it, Vanessa finally allowed herself a moment to sit back on her heels and simply look. The foal's breathing had evened out slightly, the bluish tint to its gums less pronounced. It was not out of danger, far from it, but it had a fighting chance now. And sometimes, she thought grimly, a fighting chance was all anyone needed. She sat there for a long while, not moving, The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the faint, wet sighs of the foal's breathing. The reality of what had just unfolded pressed in around her. A wild Mustang had dragged its injured baby through a freezing wilderness and laid it at the feet of a stranger who hadn't spoken to another soul in months, a stranger who had barely managed to drag herself out of bed most mornings. Why her? Why now? Vanessa stared into the flames, searching for answers that refused to come. The thought gnawed at her as she rose stiffly, pulling another blanket from the closet and draping it over the foal's shivering form. She should contact someone, a vet, animal services, someone who could take over, who knew what they were doing. But the idea of handing over this fragile life to strangers, of letting it vanish into the bureaucracy of lost causes and low-priority cases, filled her with a dread she couldn't quite explain. She remembered too well what it felt like to have something precious reduced to a file folder, a case number, a polite condolence letter. Not this time. Not if she could help it. Her gaze drifted to the photograph on the table. Jake, captured forever in that moment of pure, unguarded joy. His cap crooked on his head, his arm thrown around her shoulders. She remembered how stubborn he'd been as a kid, how he'd once spent an entire afternoon coaxing a half-drowned kitten out of a storm drain with bits of beef jerky and whispered promises. "Can't just leave it there, Mom," he'd said, his young face fierce with conviction. "It needs us." The memory hit her like a punch to the gut. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself, before returning to the foal's side. She needed a name. You didn't fight for something nameless. You didn't pour your heart into saving a blank slate. The word rose in her mind, clear and insistent, as if it had been waiting there all along. "Faith," she whispered. The foal stirred slightly at the sound, one ear flicking toward her voice, and Vanessa felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It was a tiny reaction, almost nothing, but after months of numbness, it was everything. Faith. She wasn't out of the woods yet. Neither of them were. There would be infections to fight, a broken leg to heal, trust to build inch by fragile inch. Vanessa knew the odds weren't good. But then again, the odds hadn't been good when she signed up for the army either, or when she'd gone back for wounded comrades under fire, or when she'd sat through endless days of rehab, rebuilding her own broken body after a roadside bomb left her half-shattered. The odds had never mattered. What mattered was the fight. What mattered was showing up. Vanessa leaned back against the wall, exhaustion settling into her bones, but a different kind of tiredness than the one she had carried for so long. Not the soul-sucking fatigue of grief. This was the tiredness that came after a long, hard battle, the kind that meant you had done something, that something had mattered. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the eaves and pushing snow against the door in drifts. Somewhere in the darkness, she imagined the mare, Faith's mother, standing guard, unseen but present, waiting, trusting. Vanessa didn't know what the next hours would bring. She didn't know if Faith would live through the night. But for the first time in months, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. The night was a slow, endless battle against fear and exhaustion. Vanessa sat at the table, one hand resting lightly on Faith's tiny, fragile body, feeling the faint pulse beat against her palm like the ticking of a very small, very delicate clock. She fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford, not tonight. Every few minutes, she checked the foal's breathing, adjusted the blanket around her to keep the chill from creeping back in, and dipped a clean cloth into a bowl of warm sugar water, squeezing drops into the foal's mouth between breaths. It was an old trick, something her grandfather had taught her when she was a little girl, tagging along behind him on the ranch. Sugar water for shock, he'd said. Sometimes it bought you the time you needed to get real help. Sometimes it didn't. But you tried anyway, because trying was what made the difference between life and death. Trying was what mattered. Hours blurred together in the firelight. Outside the cabin, the snowstorm raged on, hammering against the roof and walls with icy fists, but inside, a fragile, stubborn warmth persisted. Faith stirred once or twice, a weak flick of her ear, a soft, broken sound escaping her throat, and each time Vanessa responded with whispered reassurances, her voice cracking from disuse but steady with determination. "You're safe," she murmured. "I've got you. Just hold on, little one." When the first pale fingers of dawn finally pushed against the horizon, it felt like a victory. Vanessa, bleary-eyed and stiff from sitting so long, rose to stretch her aching muscles and cross to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in fresh, blinding white. It was so quiet, so still, that for a moment she could almost pretend nothing had changed, that the cabin, the mountains, her life, were exactly as they had been before yesterday, but they weren't. Nothing was the same now, and as she turned back to the small, battered figure curled on her couch, Vanessa felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Something like hope, fragile but insistent. Faith was breathing easier now. The harsh rasp of the night had softened into a slower, steadier rhythm. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, just long enough for Vanessa to see the flicker of golden brown before they closed again in exhaustion. The wound on her flank had stopped weeping blood, the makeshift splint holding her broken leg firm. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Enough to hope. Vanessa moved carefully, setting a fresh pot of water to boil on the stove. She needed to sterilize more cloths, mix another batch of sugar water, think about how she would manage to feed the foal if she survived the next crucial hours. There was formula for orphaned livestock back in town. She was almost sure of it, but town felt like another universe away. 50 miles of wilderness, impassable roads, and bad memories stretched between her and civilization. She didn't even know if she was ready to go back, to face the world she'd turned her back on when grief had swallowed her whole. The idea of walking into the general store, of seeing the knowing looks, the pity thinly veiled behind polite smiles, made her stomach twist. She had come here to disappear, to be left alone with her ghosts, but now, with Faith clinging to life in her cabin, disappearing no longer seemed like an option. She could hear her grandfather's voice in her head, clear and stubborn as it had been when he was alive. "Life don't give a damn about what you're ready for, Nessie. It just comes at you, ready or not. You stand up and face it, or it runs you over." She smiled despite herself, wiping a hand across her tired eyes. He would have loved this foal. He would have told her that life sometimes shows up in the form of something small and wounded and impossibly brave, that you don't turn your back on that, no matter how broken you feel inside. A soft sound from outside pulled her back to the present. Vanessa crossed to the window, peering through the frosted glass. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible against the endless white, stood the Mustang, Faith's mother. She hadn't left. Through the storm, through the night, she had stayed, keeping vigil just out of reach. Vanessa felt something tighten in her throat, a raw, aching respect for the fierce loyalty that held the mare here. Slowly, deliberately, she opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a slap, the air sharp and bracing, but she welcomed it. It woke her up, drove the fatigue from her bones. She stood there, coatless, arms folded against the chill, and simply watched. The mare took a step forward, then another, nostrils flaring as she caught Vanessa's scent. There was no fear in her movements, only a guarded wariness, a dignity that Vanessa found herself instinctively respecting. Wild horses weren't supposed to act like this. They didn't trust humans. They didn't approach cabins in the middle of a blizzard and offer up their injured young. And yet, here she was, standing in the snow, watching Vanessa with eyes that were ancient and wise and full of something that might almost be called hope. "I'm trying," Vanessa said aloud, her voice carrying across the clearing. "I'm doing everything I can." She didn't know why she spoke. Maybe because silence had weighed so heavily on her for so long that she needed to hear her own voice. Maybe because she believed deep down that the mare would understand. The Mustang flicked her ears forward, then lowered her head slightly, an acknowledgement, a gesture of faith. Vanessa watched her for a long moment, then turned back into the cabin, closing the door gently behind her. She returned to Faith's side, feeling the comforting blast of heat from the wood stove warm her numb skin. The fold stirred again, a faint movement beneath the blankets, and Vanessa crouched down, her hand finding the soft curve of Faith's neck. "You're not alone," she whispered. "You've got someone waiting for you. So you have to fight, okay? You have to come back." The day stretched out before her, long and uncertain. There were supplies to think about, plans to make, battles to fight. But for now, in this moment, there was only the steady beat of a tiny heart beneath her fingers, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the cabin walls a wild Mustang waited too, refusing to give up, refusing to let go. And Vanessa, who had once believed herself hollowed out beyond repair, found herself making a silent promise she had not made in a very long time. She would not give up either. Later that afternoon, with the storm finally quieted and the world outside frozen beneath a pristine layer of new snow, Vanessa laced up her boots and prepared herself for the daily perimeter check, a habit ingrained in her from years of military discipline. It wasn't just about security, it was about maintaining some small thread of control in a life that had once spiraled so far beyond her reach. These walks had become ritual, a silent promise to herself that she would not completely disappear into her grief. And now, with Faith lying vulnerable on the blanket inside her cabin and the wild mare lingering in the woods, it seemed even more important to remain vigilant. Tugging on her coat, she cast one last look at the foal sleeping by the stove, then stepped into the crisp, biting air, the cold slicing through her jeans and searing the inside of her nostrils with each breath. The forest around the cabin was eerily silent, muffled under a thick blanket of snow that dulled every sound except for the faint crunch of her boots against the frozen ground. Vanessa kept her eyes sharp, scanning for any signs of movement, any disturbances that didn't belong. Years of training honed her senses into something sharper than sight alone. She could feel when something was wrong, taste the difference in the air. Her path led her past the makeshift alarm she'd strung early in her exile, tin cans on fishing line, rudimentary but effective, and she checked each one with methodical care. No one should have been able to sneak up on her here, 50 miles from the nearest town, deep in a forgotten corner of the Montana wilderness where only the desperate or the lost ventured. But, after yesterday's events, she no longer took anything for granted. As she moved beyond the perimeter of the clearing, something caught her attention, a disturbance in the otherwise untouched snow, a strange pattern that sliced through the landscape. Vanessa stopped cold, every nerve in her body going taut. The marks were fresh, unmistakably so, cutting a wide, uneven furrow through the drifts, not the clean, purposeful tracks of a deer or elk, nor the paw prints of a coyote or mountain lion. This was something heavy, something being dragged. Heart hammering, she crouched down for a closer look, fingers brushing lightly over the depression in the snow. The trail was wide and messy, almost desperate in its pattern, weaving slightly as if the thing, or creature, doing the dragging had been near collapse. Slowly she rose and followed the trail, boots crunching softly in the silent woods, senses screaming 1,000 warnings she didn't know how to interpret. The trees opened up into a small meadow, the clearing bathed in the pale, cold light of the winter sun, and there, framed against the white expanse like a ghost from some forgotten dream, stood the Mustang mare. Vanessa froze, her breath catching painfully in her chest. The horse's coat was the color of storm clouds, a shifting, smoky gray that seemed almost to absorb the light. Her sides heaved with exhaustion, steam rising from her nostrils, and clamped tightly in her teeth was a battered canvas bag, the same one Vanessa had seen before. The mare's eyes, dark and intelligent, locked onto hers with a focus that felt almost human, a silent plea radiating from the animal in a way that words never could. Neither moved for a long moment, two beings caught in a fragile bubble of stillness. Then, with agonizing slowness, the mare released the bag. It fell into the snow with a soft, almost apologetic thud. Vanessa's heart lodged in her throat as the bag twitched once, then again, a small, weak movement from inside that sent a jolt of electricity through her spine. Every instinct screamed at her to be cautious. Wild animals were unpredictable, dangerous, but something deeper, something ancient and unspoken, told her she was being trusted. Chosen. With movements slow and deliberate, Vanessa stepped forward, her boots crunching softly through the snow. The Mustang remained where she was, ears pricked forward, muscles trembling but unyielding. Vanessa knelt beside the bag, her hands careful, methodical, as she worked the frozen zipper open inch by painstaking inch. The stench hit her first. Blood, urine, sickness, a pungent cocktail that dragged her violently back to the battlefield, to the endless triage tents where lives balanced on the edge of disaster. Steeling herself, she peeled back the canvas and saw the small, broken figure curled within. A second foal. It was even smaller than Faith, its coat a darker, richer bay hidden beneath a thick crust of filth and dried blood. One leg bent at an unnatural angle, ribs protruding sharply beneath the skin. It didn't move at her touch, didn't even whimper, and for one terrible, gut-wrenching moment, Vanessa thought she was too late. But then she felt it, the faintest flicker of a pulse beneath her fingers, the fragile, desperate beat of a life not yet extinguished. Jesus, what had they done to you? The words slipped from her lips without thought, carried on a breath that frosted instantly in the cold air. She looked up at the mare, her own eyes burning with unshed tears. The horse hadn't run, hadn't turned away or fled into the safety of the trees. She had stayed, standing like a sentinel over her shattered offspring, placing her fragile hope in the hands of a broken woman who had once sworn she would never save another life again. Vanessa didn't hesitate. Shrugging off her heavy jacket, she wrapped it around the second foal, feeling the animal's shudders as the sudden warmth seeped into its broken body. It was lighter than Faith had been, frighteningly so, and she cradled it against her chest as she rose to her feet. The mare took a tentative step forward, her nostrils flaring, but Vanessa spoke softly, soothingly, promising without words that she would do everything she could. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, careful procession through the snow. Vanessa's arms ached with the strain of carrying the fragile bundle, but she didn't falter. The mare followed at a distance, head lowered, breath pluming in the air, never letting Vanessa out of her sight. And though every step forward was a battle against exhaustion, against fear, against the creeping doubt that whispered she was in over her head, Vanessa kept moving, because this time it wasn't just her life that hung in the balance. When they finally reached the cabin, Vanessa paused on the porch, shifting the foal's weight to one arm long enough to open the door. Inside, Faith lifted her head weakly, her ears twitching at the sudden rush of cold air and the scent of new arrival. Vanessa carried the second foal to the fireside, laying it gently on a fresh blanket beside Faith's makeshift bed. She moved quickly, efficiently, setting to work cleaning the new arrival's wounds, checking for fractures, assessing the extent of the damage. The mare hovered at the doorway, refusing to cross the threshold, but her presence filled the cabin as surely as if she had. Vanessa could feel the weight of her gaze on every movement she made, a silent, wordless pressure that demanded everything she had to give. Hours later, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the world outside faded into blue twilight, Vanessa sat between the two foals, one hand resting on each fragile body. Faith stirred in her sleep, curling slightly toward the new arrival, and the second foal responded with a faint, broken whimper, a sound of recognition, of kinship, of hope. And for the first time since the war, since the funeral, since the endless nights when she had wanted nothing more than to disappear into the wilderness and never be found, Vanessa felt herself tethered again, not by grief or guilt, but by something stronger, by responsibility, by connection, by love. She had been chosen for a reason, and she would not let them down. The hours after rescuing the second foal unfolded in a strange, almost sacred hush, as if the very walls of the cabin understood the weight of what had happened and dared not intrude. Vanessa moved between the two injured creatures with a solemn grace, tending wounds, monitoring breathing, wrapping frail limbs in layers of warmth. Her hands, so steady in battlefields and chaos, worked with a gentleness she hadn't realized she still possessed. Outside the windows, the Montana wilderness lay under a frozen white shroud, deceptively peaceful, hiding dangers and secrets beneath its glittering surface. Every now and then, Vanessa glanced up, catching glimpses of the Mustang mare who remained just beyond the clearing's edge, her gray coat blending almost seamlessly into the twilight shadows, her presence an anchor for the fragile lives inside. Night deepened, wrapping the cabin in its inky embrace, and Vanessa prepared for another vigil. She fortified the fire with more wood, set out extra blankets, filled bowls with fresh water. She whispered promises into the dim light, not only to the foals but to herself. She would not lose them, not now, not after everything they had already endured to find her. She cradled faith first, encouraging sips of sugar water that the foal greedily accepted with more strength than the day before, then turned her attention to the new arrival, who was weaker still, trembling violently even under the weight of heavy blankets. Her medical instincts screamed warnings: dehydration, hypothermia, shock. She needed veterinary supplies, real antibiotics, splints, better bandages. Yet to leave now, to abandon them even for a few hours, was unthinkable. The roads might be impassable, the town indifferent or suspicious, and she couldn't risk what little ground they had gained. The second foal needed a name. Vanessa hesitated, watching the tiny chest rise and fall with agonizing slowness. Where faith had been a flicker of stubborn determination from the start, this one was more delicate, more uncertain, as if unsure whether life was something worth holding on to. Hope, Vanessa whispered, the name forming naturally, instinctively, from the battered pieces of her heart. Faith and hope, two tiny lives entrusted to her broken hands, breathing purpose back into the hollow spaces grief had carved inside her. She leaned back, exhaustion tugging at her eyelids, but forced herself to stay awake. She talked softly to them, telling stories about the mountains, about summers spent chasing fireflies through meadows with her grandfather, about Jake and the time he'd tried to build a treehouse that had ended in hilarious disaster. The words came slowly at first, but then faster, spilling out in a steady stream, as if by speaking them aloud she could somehow tether herself more firmly to this fragile new reality. The hours dragged on. Vanessa rose and paced the cabin, checked the perimeter again, peered out into the darkness where the mare still waited, unwavering. The bond between the horse and her offspring was tangible, almost visible, stretching between the trees and the cabin like a taut silver wire. Vanessa marveled at the loyalty, the trust it must have taken for the Mustang to approach her in the first place, dragging hope through miles of snow, fighting exhaustion and terror and instinct just to place her broken child at the feet of a stranger. What kind of desperate wisdom had guided her? What ancient, primal understanding had told her that in all the vast, unyielding wilderness, this lonely cabin was the one place where help could be found? As the first gray hints of dawn tinged the horizon, Vanessa opened the door and stepped out into the biting cold. The mare lifted her head immediately, ears pricking forward, muscles tense but not retreating. Vanessa stood for a long moment, just breathing the frozen air, feeling it scrape against her lungs like sandpaper, feeling herself alive and present in a way she hadn't for months. She made a decision then, a decision bigger than one foal, bigger even than the two lives now warming inside her cabin. She would fight for them, not just faith and hope, but for the mare, for the wildness and loyalty and courage embodied in her smoky grey coat and fierce dark eyes. Whatever it cost, however long it took, she would stand between them and whatever forces had tried to destroy them. Inside, she found both foals sleeping, their bodies huddled close together beneath the heavy blankets. The sight undid her in a way that nothing else could have. She dropped to her knees beside them, bowing her head, letting silent tears soak into the rough weave of her jeans. It wasn't sorrow anymore. It wasn't grief. It was something deeper, something older. A connection to life's raw, stubborn will to endure even when everything sensible said to surrender. She rose slowly, joints creaking from long hours on the floor, and set about preparing for the day. She catalogued supplies with brutal honesty, enough formula for maybe 2 more feedings, antibiotics dangerously low, bandages running out. It was no longer a matter of if she would go into town. It was when. She scrawled a rough list on a scrap of paper: feed, antibiotics, medical tape, antiseptic, needles for injections. And food for herself, too, though the thought of eating seemed foreign now, secondary to the urgent needs around her. Her truck sat half buried in snow beside the cabin, its old engine stubborn and resentful after weeks of disuse. Vanessa shoveled it free with grim determination, every motion carving purpose into her limbs, every breath steaming out in hard-won defiance of the cold. She loaded her remaining supplies for the foals inside the cabin where they would be safe and warm until she returned. And before she left, she knelt one more time between faith and hope, resting a hand lightly on each of their fragile bodies. "I'll be back," she promised. "I swear it." As she stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind her, she turned and caught one last glimpse of the smoky grey mare at the edge of the clearing. The horse watched her with a calm, steady gaze, neither pleading nor retreating, only waiting, trusting, knowing that their fragile little world now depended on a woman who had once thought she had nothing left to give. Vanessa climbed into the truck, turned the key, and coaxed the reluctant engine into life. As she drove down the narrow, snow-choked road toward Rustling Creek, she carried with her the weight of 2 foals' lives, the silent loyalty of a wild mare, and a new and unfamiliar sensation humming beneath her ribs, a fierce, unrelenting determination that this time she would not fail. The drive to Rustling Creek felt endless, the truck grumbling beneath Vanessa's hands as it fought its way over rutted, snowbound roads that seemed to narrow with every passing mile. The mountains loomed around her, vast and indifferent, their peaks wreathed in the silver mist of the retreating storm. Each turn of the wheel, each mile of slippery, treacherous earth was a gamble against nature itself. But she didn't slow, didn't falter. Her mind was already racing ahead, cataloguing supplies, anticipating obstacles, weighing risks against the fragile lives she'd left curled together under a pile of blankets back at the cabin, faith and hope. Their survival depended on her now, and failure was simply not an option she would allow herself to consider. Rustling Creek, when it finally came into view, seemed almost like a memory rather than a place. A handful of weathered buildings clustered along a single main street, windows glowing faintly with early morning light. The town was still rubbing the sleep from its eyes, smoke curling from chimneys into the pale winter sky, the scent of burning pine and damp earth heavy in the air. Vanessa eased the truck into a parking space outside the feed store, the tires crunching noisily over the frozen gravel, and sat for a moment, gathering herself. It had been months since she'd been here, months since she'd spoken more than a handful of words to another human being. And now, the idea of stepping back into the world of conversations and curious stares tightened her chest like a vice. She forced herself to breathe. This wasn't about her anymore. The old bell over the feed store door jangled sharply as she entered, the sound shattering the early morning stillness. Chester Mills looked up from behind the counter, his heavy brows lifting in surprise as he took in her appearance. Vanessa knew how she must look, disheveled, hollow-eyed, still wearing the same battered coat she'd used to wrap the second foal. But Chester didn't comment. He simply set down his newspaper, wiped his hands on his jeans, and gave her a nod that was almost a salute. "Mornin', Vanessa," he said in his gravelly voice. "Heard you were back up at the old Miller place. Wasn't sure if it was true." She managed a nod, her voice rough with disuse when she finally spoke. "I need supplies. Urgently." Without asking unnecessary questions, Chester gestured to the aisles lined with bags of feed, veterinary supplies, and rugged equipment meant for the hard lives of ranchers and farmers. Vanessa handed him the crumpled list she'd scribbled on the dashboard during the drive. Chester's eyebrows climbed higher as he scanned the items. Formula, bandages, antiseptics, syringes, antibiotics. Supplies not for cattle or hardy ranch horses, but for creatures far more delicate, for foals fighting for their lives. "You got sick stock up there?" he asked, keeping his tone carefully neutral. Vanessa hesitated, then gave a small, grim nod. 2 injured foals, wild ones. Chester's mouth tightened, but he said nothing for a moment, only reaching for a pair of battered reading glasses and studying the list again. Finally he said, "You'll want Dr. Hammond's input. Some of this ain't easy to dose right without experience." Vanessa stiffened instinctively. "I can handle it," she said quickly, the defensive edge in her voice sharper than she intended. Chester looked at her for a long moment, his expression a complicated mix of sympathy and the hard pragmatism born from a lifetime in a place where survival often hinged on stubbornness. "You can handle it, sure," he agreed slowly, gathering the supplies with deliberate care. "But sometimes handling it means knowing when to ask for help." He moved efficiently around the store, pulling items from shelves, filling a battered cardboard box with everything she would need, and a few things she hadn't thought to ask for, but would undoubtedly need later. "Tell you what," he said as he placed the final bottle into the box. "Doc Hammond's office is just down the street, end of Main, blue building with the horse weather vane. Good man, quiet. Won't ask too many questions if you don't want to answer 'em." Vanessa hesitated, the weight of her stubborn pride warring with the fierce, gnawing fear for the 2 foals left behind. Every instinct screamed at her to do this alone, to bear the burden herself. She had trusted others once, and the cost had been more than she could endure. But she had made a promise, to faith, to hope, to herself, and promises were heavier than fear. She nodded once, curtly, and Chester's lined face softened, just a fraction. After settling up, she carried the heavy box out to her truck, her boots crunching in the frozen gravel. The main street of Rustling Creek was waking up slowly, a few early risers stepping out into the cold, their eyes lingering a little too long as they recognized her. Vanessa Miller, the war widow, the recluse, the ghost who had disappeared into the woods. She ignored the stares, loading the supplies into the passenger seat and slamming the door harder than necessary, the thud echoing sharply against the quiet street. The blue building was exactly where Chester had said it would be, a squat, practical structure with a weathered horse-shaped weather vane creaking gently in the breeze. Vanessa parked out front and sat for a moment, staring at the building, gathering the strength she would need for this next conversation. Then, with a deep breath, she climbed out of the truck and crossed the distance to the door. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay. A younger woman in scrubs looked up from the reception desk, startled but polite. "Can I help you?" Vanessa didn't bother with small talk. "I need to see Dr. Hammond. It's urgent." The woman blinked, clearly not used to emergencies first thing in the morning, but she nodded and disappeared into the back. A moment later, Dr. Lewis Hammond appeared, a tall man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a calm, unhurried air that immediately set Vanessa slightly more at ease. He listened without interruption as she explained, briefly, sparingly, about the 2 foals, about the injuries, about the Mustang mare who had somehow trusted her enough to seek help. Hammond's eyes sharpened at the mention of the injuries, his mouth tightening in a way that suggested he was no stranger to the darker sides of humanity. "You did good work, keeping them alive this long," he said finally. "But you're right to come for help. Foals that young, especially ones injured that badly, need more than just grit and instinct. They need precision, and fast." He asked a few more questions, making quick notes, then stood. "I'll gather what you need, and then I'll follow you back up there, if that's all right." Vanessa hesitated. She hated the idea of a stranger seeing her sanctuary, her place of solitude, But then she thought of Faith's fragile breaths, of Hope's broken leg, and the decision was made. Fine, but hurry. Hammond smiled faintly, the expression reassuring. Don't worry, Ms. Miller, you'll have your backup. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Vanessa realized she wasn't entirely alone anymore. Somewhere in the cold heart of Montana, a small alliance was forming, fragile, imperfect, but real. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The drive back up the mountain was worse than Vanessa had anticipated. The morning sun, weak and low on the horizon, did little to melt the thick ice crusting the narrow road. Her tires skidded dangerously more than once, the truck shuddering beneath her, but she wrestled the wheel with grim determination. Dr. Hammond's vehicle followed at a cautious distance, its headlights barely piercing the swirling snow kicked up by her tires. Vanessa's mind raced faster than her engine, haunted by the memory of Faith's fragile breathing, Hope's trembling body, the silent weight of the Mustang mare's steady, trusting gaze. Every bump in the road, every slip of the tires sent a jolt of fear lancing through her. She needed to get back. Now, when she finally rounded the last bend and the cabin came into view, a wave of relief washed over her so intense it almost stole her breath. The cabin stood against the landscape like a stubborn relic of another time, smoke still trailing weakly from the chimney. No signs of disturbance, no intruders. Vanessa pulled the truck to a sliding stop beside the porch, killed the engine, and threw herself from the cab, her boots crunching through the snow as she sprinted up the steps and yanked the door open. Inside, the warmth of the fire had kept the worst of the cold at bay. Faith lifted her head at the sudden commotion, her golden eyes blinking sleepily, while Hope lay curled against her, smaller and weaker, but still breathing, still fighting. Relief buckled Vanessa's knees for a moment, and she leaned heavily against the doorframe, forcing herself to breathe. They were alive. They were still alive. Hammond arrived moments later, his arms laden with a medical bag and supplies. His sharp eyes took in the scene immediately, the makeshift bedding on the floor, the careful arrangement of bowls and blankets, the two injured foals huddled together for warmth. He said nothing, only set down his bag and knelt beside them, his movements efficient and gentle. Vanessa hovered nearby, every nerve in her body taut with worry, as Hammond examined each foal in turn, checking pulses, temperatures, hydration levels. His touch was practiced, confident, full of the kind of knowledge Vanessa knew she didn't yet have, but desperately needed to learn. Faith, to Vanessa's immense relief, was stronger than before. The antibiotics were working, the splint had held. Her vital signs were better than Hammond had expected. Hope, however, was a different story. The little filly was still dangerously weak, her leg a swollen, angry mess that spoke of infection and deep trauma. Hammond's brow furrowed as he palpated the injury, his mouth set in a grim line. "She's tougher than she looks," he said eventually, injecting Hope carefully with a stronger antibiotic. "But it's going to be close. The infection's bad. We'll need to monitor her around the clock." He glanced up at Vanessa, and there was something in his expression, a mixture of admiration and warning. "You've done good, real good, keeping them alive this long, but this isn't going to be easy. You ready for that?" Vanessa met his gaze squarely, her voice steady when she answered, "I don't leave anyone behind." Something in Hammond's face softened, and he nodded once, briskly, accepting her answer without question. Together they worked through the morning and into the early afternoon, cleaning wounds, changing dressings, feeding the foals small amounts of warmed formula every hour, logging every temperature change and sign of progress. Time blurred, broken only by the ritual of care, the shared battle to keep two fragile lives tethered to the world. Outside, the Mustang mare kept vigil. Vanessa saw her now and then through the cabin window, a silent, unwavering sentinel at the edge of the clearing, as if she too understood the stakes and was lending her strength to the fight. The mare's presence was a constant source of comfort, a living reminder that this battle wasn't just about two broken foals. It was about family, about loyalty, about trust. As the afternoon deepened into the long shadows of evening, Hammond finally leaned back from his work with a satisfied sigh. "They're stable for now," he said, stripping off his gloves and tossing them into the fire where they hissed and curled into ash. "That's the best we can hope for today." He turned to Vanessa, his expression serious. "You'll need more supplies soon. More antibiotics, specialized feed, maybe even IV fluids if Hope doesn't start eating properly by tomorrow. And if you're willing," he added after a pause, "I'll teach you how to do it all. Field care, emergency protocols, everything you'll need to give them the best shot." Vanessa felt something tighten in her throat. Not fear, not even gratitude exactly, but a fierce, aching relief. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. She would learn whatever it took. She would become what they needed, no matter what. Hammond packed up his things slowly, clearly reluctant to leave, but understanding there was little more he could do tonight. Before he left, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and pressed it into Vanessa's hand. "List of contacts," he said. "Suppliers, transporters, people who don't ask too many questions. If it gets bad, if you need backup, you call me." Vanessa nodded again, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of hope sparking to life inside her chest, fragile and trembling, but real. After Hammond's truck disappeared down the snow-clogged road, Vanessa stood for a long time on the porch, staring out into the thickening twilight. The mare lifted her head at the sound of the door, her dark eyes meeting Vanessa's across the clearing. Neither of them moved for a long time, two sentries bound by an unspoken understanding. Then, slowly, Vanessa stepped down from the porch and walked toward her, each footfall deliberate, careful, non-threatening. She stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to see the scars along the mare's flank, the dried blood at the edge of a still fresh wound. Vanessa crouched low, arms resting on her knees, and spoke softly into the cold evening air. "You trusted me with your foals," she said. "Now I'm asking you to trust me with you." For a moment, nothing happened. The wind stirred the snow into ghostly wisps between them. Then, astonishingly, the mare took a single step forward, her muscles trembling, her breath visible in great white puffs. Another step, another, until she stood just close enough that Vanessa could have reached out and touched her. But she didn't. She simply sat, quiet and still, offering her presence, her promise. The mare lowered her head, her nostrils flaring, and blew warm breath into Vanessa's hair. A greeting, an acceptance. Vanessa closed her eyes, overwhelmed. Somehow, against every odd, a bridge had been built, not just between human and horse, but between two broken souls, two survivors battered by a world that often offered more cruelty than kindness. As night closed in around them, the woman and the wild mare stood together at the edge of the woods, guardians of two fragile lives and the improbable new family they had created. And somewhere deep inside her chest, where for so long there had been only emptiness, Vanessa felt something small and fierce ignite, the beginning of a new purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to hope. The next morning, Vanessa woke to the muted sound of wind brushing against the cabin walls and the steady, reassuring crackle of the fire she had banked through the night. She rose slowly from the threadbare armchair where she had spent most of the night dozing fitfully, always half awake, her ears tuned for the smallest sound of distress from the foals. But when she moved toward their makeshift bed, a surge of cautious hope quickened her step. Faith lifted her head, blinking at her with those soulful golden-brown eyes, weak still but alert. Hope, smaller and more fragile, stirred beside her, her breathing shallow but steady. It was a victory, however small, and Vanessa savored it like a starving person savoring a crumb of bread. After checking their temperatures and coaxing them to sip a little more warmed formula, Vanessa bundled herself against the morning chill and stepped outside. The world beyond the cabin was wrapped in the soft hush of fresh snow, the sky a heavy, brooding gray. Standing at the edge of the clearing, the Mustang mare waited, as constant and unyielding as the mountains themselves. Vanessa smiled, a fleeting but genuine expression, and raised a hand in silent greeting. Somehow they had made it through another night. The hours that followed were filled with work, grinding, painstaking, repetitive. Vanessa cleaned wounds, changed dressings, administered antibiotics, charted every tiny change in the foal's conditions with a diligence that would have impressed her old field hospital commanders. She barely ate, barely rested. Time folded in on itself until all that mattered was keeping those fragile lives tethered to the world. She didn't notice the passing of the day until the light began to fade and the cold crept deeper into the cabin once again. It was then, as she was preparing another batch of formula, that she heard it, the distant, unmistakable rumble of an engine. Vanessa froze, her entire body going still as instinct took over. She moved swiftly to the window, her heart slamming against her ribs as she peered out into the gathering dusk. A black pickup truck, large and gleaming even under a dusting of snow, was making its way up the narrow path to her cabin. It wasn't Hammond's old battered truck or any local she recognized. No, this truck was different, menacing, out of place. Vanessa's blood turned to ice. She knew, deep in her bones, who it was before she even saw the man climb out of the driver's seat. Harrison Wells, the rancher who had long sought to erase the wild Mustangs from these mountains to protect his own interests, no matter the cruelty it entailed. He was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered and exuding a casual arrogance that set her teeth on edge. He didn't belong to this land, not really. He was a man who measured his worth in cattle brands and acreage, in power brokered behind closed doors. Vanessa shut the door quietly and stepped out onto the porch, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. Wells stood at the foot of her porch steps, hands raised slightly in a mockery of peace, a thin smile stretching across his face. "Evening, Miss Miller," he drawled, the words slick with false friendliness. "Heard you were back up here. Thought I might stop by, neighborly courtesy and all." Vanessa didn't return his smile. "You're trespassing," she said flatly. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." Wells chuckled, as if she had made a joke, and took a casual step closer. "Come now," he said, voice smooth and dangerous. "No need for hostility. Just heard you might have come across a wild foal, or two. Thought maybe you could use a little help. Professional help." Vanessa stiffened, her muscles coiling with tension. "I don't need anything from you," she said, her voice low and sharp. "And the foals are none of your concern." Wells' eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He shifted his weight, his boots crunching on the icy ground, and when he spoke again, the pretense of neighborly concern had vanished. "You're harboring wild Mustangs," he said, his voice now as cold as the wind blowing down from the peaks. "You know that's illegal, especially if those horses are part of an active population control operation." Vanessa felt a surge of anger rise in her throat. "Population control?" she spat. "Is that what you call breaking a foal's leg and leaving it to die in the snow?" For a moment the mask slipped. Wells's mouth twisted into something ugly, something predatory. Then he smoothed his features into a facsimile of calm. "Accidents happen during roundups," he said lightly. "It's unfortunate, but necessary. Wild horses destroy grazing land, spread disease. They're pests, Ms. Miller. You know that as well as I do. Your grandfather understood." The invocation of her grandfather's name hit harder than she expected. Vanessa took a step forward, her hands fisting at her sides. "My grandfather loved these horses," she said fiercely. "He taught me to respect them, to protect them, not to slaughter them for profit." Wells' eyes gleamed with something like amusement. "Times change," he said. "The world's not sentimental anymore, Miss Miller. It's practical, ruthless when it has to be." "Then I guess I'll be ruthless too," Vanessa snapped, her voice vibrating with barely contained fury. "If you come near this cabin, near these foals again, you'll find out exactly how ruthless I can be." For a long moment they stared each other down, two forces of nature locked in a silent battle. Then, with a small mocking salute, Wells turned and climbed back into his truck. "Suit yourself. he called as he started the engine. "But be careful who you make enemies with, Miss Miller. Up here, accidents happen all the time." Vanessa watched the black pickup disappear down the winding road, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Only when the truck was a distant speck did she turn and re-enter the cabin, bolting the door behind her. Inside, Faith and Hope stirred uneasily, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Vanessa knelt between them, resting a hand on each foal's trembling body. She closed her eyes and made a silent promise. To them, to herself, to the spirit of the grandfather who had once told her that some battles were worth fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. Wells might have wealth, influence, and cruelty on his side, but Vanessa had something stronger. She had a cause. She had purpose. And most of all, she had the unbreakable bond that had formed between a broken soldier, two wounded foals, and the wild mare who had trusted her with everything she loved. They were a family now, and Vanessa Miller would fight to the end to protect them. The snowstorm that had threatened all day finally arrived just after sunset. Thick, heavy flakes descended in a relentless curtain, shrouding the wilderness in silence and swallowing the distant outlines of the mountains. Inside the cabin, Vanessa worked by the yellow glow of oil lamps, her hands moving steadily as she prepared for what she knew was coming. She moved from task to task without hesitation, securing every window latch, double-checking the fuel levels for the generator she rarely used, counting her remaining supplies and rations. It wasn't fear that drove her now, but a grim, razor-sharp focus born from years spent under siege conditions. Afghanistan had taught her how to survive storms of every kind: bullets, sand, betrayal. A snowstorm and a threat from a rich rancher felt almost familiar in its own strange, terrible way. Faith and Hope lay close together by the fire, their breathing still labored but stronger, steadier. Every few hours Vanessa rotated them carefully, coaxing a few sips of formula into them, massaging their legs to keep the circulation flowing. They were fighters, survivors, just like her. Outside the cabin, the wild Mustang mare remained invisible, but Vanessa knew she was there, lurking just beyond the tree line, a silent guardian whose faith in Vanessa had never wavered. She drew strength from that knowledge, tucking it deep inside herself where Wells's threats couldn't reach. Hours dragged by. Vanessa sat at the scarred wooden table, her old service revolver laid beside a notebook filled with hastily scribbled plans. There was no guarantee Wells would make another move tonight, but she wasn't betting on his patience. Men like him didn't like to be challenged. They especially hated losing control. Vanessa didn't intend to give him a second chance to catch her off guard. Every creak of the cabin walls, every moan of the wind outside set her nerves jangling. She forced herself to stay still, to breathe, to wait. Then, sometime after midnight, the unmistakable sound of an engine cut through the howling wind. Headlights briefly slashed across the tree line before being extinguished, plunging the world back into darkness. Vanessa rose silently, her body moving before her mind fully registered it. She slipped on her jacket, grabbed the revolver, and crouched beside the window, heart pounding in her ears. Through the driving snow, she spotted shadowy figures moving at the edge of the clearing. 3, maybe 4 men. No uniforms, no lights, no official vehicles. Just heavy boots and muffled shouts as they fumbled toward the cabin. Wells hadn't come himself, of course. Men like him rarely dirtied their hands directly. Instead, he had sent hired muscle, men with enough greed or desperation to do whatever was asked without questioning orders. Vanessa watched them fan out around the cabin, setting up a perimeter like a pack of wolves circling wounded prey. She knew this tactic: intimidation first, force if necessary. Vanessa turned back to the foals. Faith stirred fitfully, whimpering in her sleep. Hope shivered against her sister, the tiny filly's body still frighteningly fragile. Vanessa tightened her grip on the revolver and moved to stand between them and the door. She wasn't going to let them inside, not without a fight, not ever. The first bang on the door echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, heavy fists pounding against the old wood. A gruff voice barked through the storm. "Open up, lady. We don't want no trouble. Just hand over the horses and nobody gets hurt." Vanessa didn't answer. She pressed her back to the wall, revolver in hand, heart steady now. She waited, listened. Another bang, louder. The wood creaked ominously under the assault. She could hear the men outside arguing, cursing the weather, debating their next move. She caught snippets through the roar of the storm. Break it down. She's alone. Wells wants it done tonight. The third strike against the door nearly splintered it. Vanessa knew she couldn't hold the cabin indefinitely. It was too small, too isolated. So she made a decision. Slipping out the back door into the freezing night, she moved like a shadow through the snow, circling wide around the cabin toward the forest where the mayor would be watching. Her plan was reckless, half-formed, but it was the only one she had. Draw the men away from the cabin. Lead them into unfamiliar territory. Divide and conquer. She whistled sharply, a single piercing note that cut through the blizzard. A few seconds later, a low whinny answered her. The mare emerged from the trees like a ghost, her smoke-colored coat blending into the storm. Vanessa approached her slowly, whispering low and fast. "We need to move now." Miraculously, the mare seemed to understand. As the cabin door finally burst inward behind them, the two slipped into the dark woods, their forms swallowed by the swirling snow. The men shouted when they realized she was gone, their flashlights sweeping wildly over the clearing. Vanessa crouched low, moving from tree to tree, her breath burning in her lungs. She led them deeper into the forest, away from the cabin, away from the foals, away from everything she couldn't afford to lose. It was slow, brutal work. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, cold and terror. But the storm was her ally now, covering her tracks, confusing their pursuit. She heard the men cursing as they stumbled after ghostly shadows, falling over hidden roots and snowdrifts, shouting conflicting orders into the wind. One by one, they fell behind, disoriented and exhausted. When she finally judged they were far enough away, Vanessa looped back toward the cabin in a wide arc, her limbs trembling with the effort. She climbed the final ridge on hands and knees, her entire body screaming for rest, and looked down through the trees. The cabin stood silent and battered but intact. No sign of the men, no headlights, no movement. Inside, Faith and Hope would be waiting, terrified and alone. She forced herself to her feet and stumbled down the hill, every step a battle of will over body. When she reached the cabin, she slipped through the broken door and fell to her knees beside the foals, clutching them both to her chest. Faith whimpered softly, nuzzling her hand, as if to say, "You came back. You didn't leave us." "I told you," Vanessa whispered hoarsely into the thick silence. "I don't leave anyone behind." She sat there for a long time, cradling them as the fire guttered low and the storm raged outside. Somewhere deep in the wilderness, the Mustang mare stood guard over the land they had fought to defend. The storm would pass, the broken door would be mended, the threats would return. Vanessa knew all of that. But for now, in that tiny, battered cabin at the edge of the world, she had won. She had found a new purpose, a new family, and no force of nature or cruelty of men would ever take that from her again.